When an elderly man heard the faint cries of babies near a grave, he was overcome with curiosity and concern. Unable to ignore the eerie sounds, he decided to investigate, digging into the earth with trembling hands. What he uncovered left him utterly shocked. Brandon Williams was left heartbroken and alone after losing his beloved wife, Rebecca. Burying her was the most devastating moment of his life, as he had always cherished her and lived for their shared happiness. Together, they had explored cities across Canada and beyond, driven by their love for travel and adventure. Their dream was to see the world, and they spent much of their time journeying from one place to another, creating memories that Brandon now held close to his heart. Brandon and Rebecca lived like nomads, embracing new experiences in every country they visited. With no children to tie them down, they had the freedom to explore, never staying in one place for too long. However, after years of marriage, they decided it was time to start a family. What seemed like a simple decision soon became a challenge, as months passed with no pregnancy. After 11 months of trying, they sought medical help. When the test results came in, Rebecca met Brandon at the hospital entrance, clutching a brown file with trembling hands. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Brandon, you're free to do whatever you want. I have no right to hold you back." Confused, Brandon pressed her for an explanation. With a heavy heart, Rebecca turned away, her voice breaking. "The thing is, I can't give you a child," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. Brandon stood in stunned silence. This was the last thing he had expected to hear. After overcoming his initial shock, Brandon gently embraced Rebecca from behind and whispered, "Forget about it, Rebecca. This is our reality and I accept it. As long as I have you, I'm happy. We'll be just fine together." From that moment on, they never revisited the conversation about children. Instead, they focused on each other, cherishing their time together and making the most of life's adventures. For many years, they lived for themselves, traveling and creating memories. When Rebecca reached her mid-60s, they embarked on yet another long journey to a new city. However, a few days into their trip, she developed a persistent, severe cough. Concerned, Brandon wondered if it was an allergic reaction. After all, Rebecca was allergic to cats, and their rented house's neighbor owned a Siamese cat. Hoping the symptoms would fade, they cut their trip short and returned home to Toronto, where there were no animals around. However, Rebecca's health didn't get any better. 2 days later, Brandon took his wife to the hospital. When they got there, the chief doctor shook his head and told him his wife had developed a condition called sarcoma. Sarcoma is the type of cancer that begins in the bones of the soft tissues of the body, including cartilage, fat, muscle, blood vessels, fibrous tissues, or other connective or supportive tissue. It had spread quickly, and there was nothing they could do to save her. A week later, his wife passed away at the hospital. Shattered and in tears, the man didn't know how to live without the woman he had loved for most of his life. After her funeral, he was all alone, living in the house they had built together. He was in his 70s now and was already retired. One cold evening, he was going through all their papers at home, and he saw the same brown file his wife had held the day she had found out she couldn't have a baby. Throughout the years, he hadn't looked at what was inside. Brandon couldn't understand why his wife had kept the file. Out of curiosity, he looked inside and was shocked at what he discovered. You see, it turned out that Rebecca wasn't barren. It was he who had a medical problem. At first, he was angry that she hid the truth from him. How could she lie to him? Moments later, he cried upon realizing he had denied her the right to be a mother. If only she had talked to me, we could have found the way. After all, we could have adopted a child or tried artificial insemination, said the elderly man as he wept silently, but in truth, Rebecca wanted no children, even after the medical checkup. This was why she took the results and made him think she was barren. It took Brandon some time to realize his wife had never wanted a child. However, he forgave her and went to her grave every morning there. He'd water the flowers and clean her grave. For no particular reason, he found pleasure in doing these things. The elderly man would sit on a wooden bench and talk to his wife. At first, he thought he could hear her chatting with him, but later he realized he was talking only to himself. It was at this point he decided to let go. Brandon stopped being unhappy and accepted the reality that his wife was no longer alive, and after some time, he became a cheerful man again. One particular morning, he took a walk down to the graveyard. This time, he no longer stayed where his wife was buried, but instead he walked around the place like it was an art gallery. The old man patiently looked at different tombstones and imagined how these people might have been when they were alive. Suddenly, he stopped at one of the fresh graves there. Normally, fresh graves were covered with flowers from grieving relatives and friends. However, this grave had no flowers on it. It just had a wooden cross, U.S. and name engraved in pencil, Emily Wilson, written without so much as a date. "Hello, Emily. I wonder who you might be, how old you were, and the things you did when you were alive," said the elderly man to himself. All of a sudden, he heard the sound from the ground. Initially, he didn't understand where it came from. He looked around, but not a single soul was there. It was at this point he realized that the shrieking sound came beneath that same fresh grave. Startled, he looked around again and found an abandoned old shovel nearby. The old man picked it up and started digging. As he continued to dig, the squeaking became louder. Soon he realized it was the cry of babies. "Who exactly are you?" "Emily, why would children be buried with you?" As soon as he opened the coffin, he threw away the shovel in shock. Right in front of him was an elderly woman, and lying by her sides were two young babies, a boy and a girl. Both babies were crying and hardly breathing with trembling hands. He took the babies to the police, who kept them in a shelter for the time being. It turned out that the old woman in the coffin was Emily Robert, who was a popular figure in the neighborhood. The police officers disclosed that the woman had just recently died. But what about the kids, and how did they end up buried with her? Before she died, Emily lived with her granddaughter, Nancy. The girl's mother passed away during childbirth, and the baby had no father. Neighbors thought she would send the child to an orphanage, but instead, she raised the girl as her child and cared for her. Unfortunately, Nancy became exactly like her mother in both appearance and behavior. In no time, the young girl started going out with men much older than her. She got pregnant, and Emily was finding it difficult to take care of the girl. The elderly woman was already very ill, and a few weeks later, she passed away. Just days after her grandmother's passing, Nancy gave birth to twins, but she wasn't ready for motherhood. Struggling financially, she could barely afford even the cheapest coffin for the burial. Overwhelmed and desperate, she made a heartbreaking decision. After being discharged from the hospital, Nancy returned to the cemetery, dug up her grandmother's grave, and placed the newborns beside the old woman before burying them together. Then, without looking back, she moved to another city to start a new life. When Brandon learned what had happened, he was in utter disbelief. Though Nancy was eventually found and sentenced for her actions, he couldn't shake the thought of the twins. Unable to forget them, he began visiting them regularly at the orphanage, drawn to the innocent lives that had barely survived such a cruel fate. During one of his visits, the nurse on duty smiled at him and said, "You have such a deep love for these babies. I don't think anyone could care for them the way you do. You're like their guardian angel, and they're lucky to have you. Honestly, I can't think of anyone better to be their parent. Why not adopt them?" Her words echoed thoughts that had already been lingering in Brandon's mind. A few days later, Brandon made the life-changing decision to adopt the children. Now, with two adorable kids by his side, he was doing just fine. He stopped visiting the graveyard and devoted himself entirely to their care, giving them all the love and support he had to offer. Though they weren't related by blood, Brandon cherished the twins as if they were his own, loving them unconditionally and embracing the joy they brought into his life. I'm really keen to know your thoughts on this story, so please don't hesitate to share your insights in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video and found it engaging, I invite you to subscribe to our channel for more similar content. Feel free to share this video. Take good care of yourselves, and I'm excited to connect with you in our future videos.